How to Study So You Can Remember Stuff, a course by Walton, cognitive hypnotherapist. In this course I'm going to teach you how people process information and give you some tips and techniques for how you can use the way you communicate to store and retain and recall information effectively. I'll also give you some tips for how to deal with the nerves that sometimes get in the way of your ability to be the best that you can be. One of the things we don't realise is that we all communicate differently. We think just because we're speaking the same language that we're understanding things in the same way. But effectively we all live in our own reality. We all have different ways of thinking and interacting with the world. And nobody can really read minds. So you don't really know what somebody else is thinking. But it's quite common to assume that when you say something, that people have taken it as you intended. I'm sure you've had experiences where that was not the case, where you didn't mean something the way somebody took something, or where you were upset by something, not realising that somebody expressed it in a way that wasn't intended to upset you. So effectively we all live in our own little reality bubbles. And if we can work out what's going on in our reality bubble, we can make the best use of it when it comes to both communicating with other people, but also processing information that's going on in our heads. So I want to start you off with a very simple question. I want you to describe walking down a beach. Now you can write this down, you can say it out loud. However you do it, just take a few moments to think how you would describe walking down a beach. Because we're going to use that in the next few slides to understand how you look at your reality and how you look at the world. So there's this thing called neuro-linguistic programming, which talks about the way our brain uses information, recalls information and stores information. And neuro-linguistic programming talks about 4 different things which it calls rep systems, but I'm going to just call communication traits. And the interesting thing about these communication traits is that we physically store the information in our brains in a location that matches what our preference is. The 4 preferences are visual, people who see things; audio, people who hear things; analytical, people who need to question and understand things; and experiential, which are the people that need to feel and experience something to understand it, or that's the way they choose to communicate. Now the interesting thing about this is, and the reason there's a diagram of a smiley face of me on there, is because you physically store that information based on where you look. So, for example, if you were to look up left, a visual person stores their information there, and it's almost like there's a filing cabinet up there in that corner. And if you look up and left, suddenly you're opening the filing cabinet and accessing all that information that's stored there. Same way for an audio person. If you look to the side, an audio person will store their information. It will be like looking in the filing cabinet there. An analytical person looking down and to the left, and an experiential person looking down and to the right. This is why if somebody says to you to look at them while they're talking to you, it's kind of hard, because that means that you don't have access to any of the information you've stored, because you'll notice that none of this is about looking straight ahead. It also means that if you're in an exam and you've got your head down looking at a piece of paper, that also doesn't tie in to the rep systems. And particularly if you're a visual person, you're actually switching off access to the information that you've stored in that top left corner. So we're going to use this knowledge to both store information and use it to recall information in an exam, where just simply sitting back and looking in a certain direction will be almost like cheating, where you're accessing that information as if it's stored in a book over there. It's not cheating, by the way, it's just using the way your brain works to work more effectively for you. So let's go through each of these in turn so you can understand a little bit more. So let's start with a visual learner. A visual learner, if I ask them to describe walking down a beach, is going to describe what they see. They might describe the colour of the sky, the colour of the beach itself. They might notice the froth on the waves. But the first thing that a visual learner will describe is what they see. That's not that that's the only word that he will use. Everybody's a little bit of everything. But that would be their first preference. The traits of a visual person are that they need to see stuff to make sense of it. Which is quite interesting because if you're a visual person, which I am by the way, when somebody says something it turns into a picture in your head. So you've got to be very careful because it very quickly can turn something into an image you don't want in your head. A visual person is likely to make lots of notes while they're studying, but actually not use them later. The act of writing something down helps them lock it into their memory. So let's talk about how you can deliberately use that to make your studying effective. Well, write stuff out. As you learn, write it out. Because as I say, as you write stuff out, it will lock it in your head. The other thing you can really do with a visual learner is you can write stuff on different coloured paper or post-it notes, and you can even use different coloured pens. Stick them up on the wall, put flowcharts, draw pictures. I always did best in the exams where I was allowed to draw pictures. Even when they were technical exams, as long as I could draw pictures, I could recall what I'd learnt in a simple way. So when you're studying, make a point of writing stuff down, putting it on the wall, laying it out, whatever it is. If it's a history exam, do a flowchart for the dates. Do different coloured post-it notes for the different significant events. Use a different coloured pen. You can do that in an exam, or maybe not. But learn using the fact that you need to put something in front of you and see it to be able to learn it. Now, when you go into an exam and you're needing to recall, the thing you can do is you can look up and left. So while you're studying and you've got all this visual stuff in front of you, if you look up and left, it's like moving it into that filing cabinet up to the left. And then when you're in an exam, if you glance up and to the left, it will be like looking in that filing cabinet and pulling all that information back. You can also visualize in your mind's eye the colour of the notes or whatever, and that will recall the facts really easily. So for a visual learner, the key thing here is to put stuff out in front of you so you can actually physically see it. Don't keep it in your head, put it out there. Use the trick of looking in the right direction to be able to access that information when you're in an exam. Now let's look at an audio learner. When I ask an audio learner to describe walking down the beach, the first thing they're probably going to do is describe what they hear. The sound of the waves, the seagulls in the background. Again, they may describe other components, but the first thing that they will probably describe is what they hear. So the traits of an audio person are they need to hear stuff to make sense of it, and so you'll often find that an audio person speaks a lot and mutters a lot, speaks out loud, because hearing their own voice can help somebody make sense of it. They also often have an ear for music. I have friends who, if they hear any song, they'll know which film it belonged to, which character sang it, all that sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily just being able to play an instrument, but actually being able to recall song lyrics and anything to do with music is a typical trait of an audio person. To study, then you need to use that. So one of the things you can do is, as you're learning stuff, speak out loud, read it out. But one of the best and most effective things you can do as an audio learner is to listen to music while you're studying. Now, a lot of people might have told you to focus and don't have any distractions and don't listen to music. But if you're an audio person, that can be a real advantage. For example, if you're learning something like history, which has a lot of facts, if you listen to the same song every time you study, then simply recalling that song will actually recall all the facts associated with it. In the same way as hearing a few tunes or a few notes from a song can help you remember the lyrics quickly, this is the same sort of technique. So remembering a song will recall the facts. So listen to a song while you're studying, listen to the same song while you're studying, and then every time you recall that song, all the facts that are associated will be with it. Again, you look to the left and sideways if you want to store that information, so that when you're in your exam, if you look to the left and sideways, the information will be there for you. But also, just thinking of the song will allow you to instantly tap into all that information. Next is the experiential learner, also called kinesthetic. If I ask an experiential person to describe walking down a beach, they're likely to pick up on things about the way they feel. So the sand between the toes, the feel of the wind on their skin, the sun warming them up. So somebody who's an experiential learner needs to actively involve themselves in something to make most sense of it, which is a bit of a tricky thing because in a standard educational system, these are the people that struggle most, because most is about visual and audio learning. So they can often seem like they're a bit slower than everybody else because to really understand something they need to get their hands in there and do something, so they tend to be more practical. In terms of studying, actually the best way to study for an experiential learner is to work out what your second trait is, because most of us have at least 2 primary traits, and study using the tips from that trait, be it audio or visual. But there's another really simple trick that you can use, and that's to have a smell near you while you're studying. Peppermint oil is a really good choice because peppermint oil actually helps you recall. For some reason, peppermint is good for recalling facts. So imagine you have some peppermint oil, or even some mints, to be honest, and as you're studying you've got that smell, so you really anchor that smell, you sniff deliberately that smell while you're studying, and then when you go into your exam you can take with you a rag with that smell on it or something like that. And I don't know if you've ever walked past a chip shop or a bakery or something like that and instantly reminded yourself of your stomach rumbling and the last time you had that food. This is the same kind of thing. So if you have a sniff of that smell, instantly you'll recall all the facts that are associated with that smell. For an experiential learner, you're looking down and to the right. So you want to make sure that you, as you're learning, as you're smelling, you look down to the right so that when you're in an exam, you can look down to the right and recall that. The last type is the thinking or the analytical learner. If I ask an analytical person to describe walking down a beach, they probably wouldn't do it. They'd probably just ask me a bunch of questions. Well, what time of day is it? What sort of beach is it? So an analytical person needs to understand why things are the way they are to make sense of stuff. They tend not to accept just do it, this is it because it is. They tend to love a debate and engaging in discussion. And really working out why stuff is the way it is. Again, with studying, you might want to look at one of your secondary traits, audio or visual, to help with study, because not all study is possible based on understanding. Again, for example, history could be a bit tricky to do it based on just an understanding. But there are other subjects that you can really focus on understanding why things are, for example, maths. So instead of just taking an equation and following the rules for that equation, you might understand why that actual equation works the way it does. So if you're doing a topic that you can understand why, that will give you a far better depth of understanding so that when you go into an exam you can apply that knowledge rather than just recalling facts. So there are some things that an analytical person can be really good for, but generally with study you're going to have to double up with one of your other traits to make it most effective for most topics, because not all topics have an analytical basis. A thinking person looks down and to the left, so again, just with all the other traits, when you're studying, look in the right direction to store that information. So we all interact and communicate differently. And we all have usually a primary trait and then one or more secondary traits. So when you're studying, use both the fact that your brain physically stores information based on the direction you look in to store and recall your facts, but also use some of the tips and techniques for that particular way of studying. So let me now talk about coping with nerves. If you think about the physical sensation of feeling nervous or feeling worried or feeling anxious, your heart rate increases, you have a shortness of breath, maybe you get a bit sweaty. This physical response is designed from the caveman days to help us go into the fight, flight or freeze mode. So if you imagine you turn a corner and there's a saber-toothed tiger there, then your subconscious takes over and gets you ready to run away or to fight. Now, it is detrimental to this process to think. So if you turn a corner and there's a saber-toothed tiger there, and you go, right, I wonder if this is my best spear, or if I can outrun it in these shoes, then you'll be dead, because it will have eaten you while you were thinking. So the first thing that happens when you are under threat is your subconscious switches off your thinking brain. The interesting thing about this is if you think about those physical symptoms, almost everybody will be able to describe the physical symptoms of anxiety or nervousness. And yet there are no saber-toothed tigers. In fact, there are no predators. So our subconscious is still triggering a fight or flight response based on things it thinks is going to hurt us emotionally. And it's treating that as if it's going to kill us, which is why sometimes when you get really nervous, it can feel like you're going to die, because to your subconscious, that's what's going to happen. If there is a lot of pressure, a fear of failure, a fear of looking silly, these things can all trigger your subconscious to take you into a fight or flight mode. The problem is, the first thing it does is it switches off your brain. So you can't do all the things that everybody tells you to do to think your way past it. Oh, you'll be alright, it's not a problem, you'll do your best on the day. All of that stuff is not available to you when you're nervous. So I want to teach you just a couple of very simple techniques that don't require your thinking brain, but allow you to regain your thinking brain so you can access all that information we've just talked about. So the first one is breathing. So the first thing that happens when you're nervous is your breathing gets very short and very regular and rhythmic. So this is to fool your brain that you're not actually nervous. So you breathe in for the count of 2 and out for the count of 2. In for the count of 3, out for the count of 3. In for the count of 4 and out for the count of 4. Do this all the way up to 10 if you can. If you can't get up to 10, go as high as you can, and then you go back to 2, and then back to 10, and back to 2. And you do that for as long as you can remember to do it, because by the time your body's calmed down, you'll have forgotten to do this. You can also do this, by the way, when you go to bed. It's a really good way to help you get to sleep. So the first thing you can do when you're feeling nervous is to just breathe. This steady breathing that is in your control fools your brain into thinking everything's okay, and it gives you your thinking brain back. The other thing you can do is you can distract your subconscious by playing a really loud song in your head. So think of a song that you love. Maybe it's the sort of song that you would sing or dance around to when nobody was watching, or maybe when somebody is watching, I don't know. But think of a good, upbeat, happy song. Imagine pressing play on that song. And when that song's playing, I want you to imagine turning the volume up. Now if you think about this, counting your breathing and imagining the song is going to take all your energy. And it's going to be pretty impossible to think of anything else at the same time. So just this simple trick in itself can help you get over nerves. So in summary, we all communicate and process information in a different way. And we just use the way that works for you to study effectively. And then combine that with a simple breathing trick, and it will allow you to retain your thinking brain and be the best version of you that you can be on the day, which, let's face it, you can only ever be the best version of you that you are right now. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, just email dawn@thinkitchangeit.com, or you can go on over to Facebook and like the page at Think It Change It for other tips and ideas about other stuff.